About 5 years ago, I was asked to join a case as an economic expert on valuation. And the song, it was a particular song that was plaintiffs were suing on infringement. But the song was so powerful for me personally and culturally that I didn't think that I could actually provide a service without gushing and getting all sentimental and spiritual, because I had to be sort of an unabashed, sort of sober economist. And that song was Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. I just said to the lawyers, I said, that song means so much to me that every time I hear it, I'm young. And every time I hear it, there's a future. And every time I hear it, there's the art of possibility. And with all that sort of drama in my mind, how can I just talk about the cash flows? It would be very hard to do that.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Barry Massarsky, who is a partner and co-practice leader, music economics and valuation services at Citrin Cooperman, the founder of Massarsky's Consulting, which he sold to Citrin Cooperman early in 2022. He is credited with pioneering the economics of royalty cash flows in the early 1990s, and together with his business partner, Nari Matsuura, developed a model to guide banks lending to music investors. Last year, Massarsky Consulting valued over 300 catalogs, totaling more than $6.5 billion. Welcome, Barry. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Actually, I have an update for you. It just came in for 2022. The numbers for what we actually accomplished in that year is that we looked at over 400 catalogs this past year, and the asset value totaled over $9 billion.
Extraordinary. Well, that just reflects some of the growth we're going to talk about. So make sure we have that updated in the show notes. Thank you. Well, let's start with where you grew up, your early interests, and how music touched on that, and how ultimately the world of music valuation was something you entered.
Thank you very much. So I grew up in the New York, New Jersey area, very conventionally in the 1960s, and went to college at Boston University. Music was always a fabric of my life. I carried music around with me in my head, listened to records. It was a primary driver to explaining the messages of life. And also the beat of music was very important culturally. So music was just everybody's sort of experience going into college years in the 1970s. I didn't know that you could create a business and a career out of music. I was quite uninformed about that. But I wound up in a very interesting path that got me to the music industry, if I might. I went to Boston University, and in my last semester of college, studying economics and political science, realizing that I needed to do something to sort of figure out the next step. It wasn't so obvious in classroom study. I took a flyer and went down to Washington, D.C., and became an economic intern on Capitol Hill on the House Banking Committee. And I thought it'd be interesting to get that experience under my belt, because otherwise I would just study at school and then look for jobs and wasn't sure what that next step would be. While I was in Washington doing this internship, I met people from the United States Justice Department who were focused on an antitrust case suing IBM for antitrust violations. I wound up being part of that research staff, a very famous case. And the story continues that the chief economist of that case was also a professor at the business school at Cornell University. And in order for me to want to go to business school, he thought I should go to his school, Cornell, so that I could continue my work for him and get my MBA studies. Okay, so that puts me at Cornell, doesn't yet put me into music. So what happened was I was very interested in economic consulting. I had an economics background, but I wanted to do it in a special place. I didn't want to do like large firm consulting. I wanted a small, highly focused microeconomics shop. And one of the firms that I was interested in interviewing with had a relationship with a music company. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And they said, your background in statistics and economics and finance really fits the purpose of this organization. And that company was called ASCAP. And they represented, thousands and thousands of songwriters and publishers when their music is publicly performed on venues such as radio and television and bars and restaurants and the like. And before I knew it, I met this incredible stellar talent named Hal David, who along with Burt Bacharach wrote many standard songs that Dionne Warwick sang in the 1960s and 70s. And all of a sudden, I'm in the music industry as an economist running the ASCAP survey and distribution of payments back to these writers and publishers. But that was because of this intermediary route of looking for a small customized consulting firm that ultimately I did work with on the client side. And then that's what started me. And I think that starting year was 1981.
And another guest we've had on this podcast, Cherise Clark-Soares, who I know you know, Harborview Equity Partners, they actually sponsored Series 1. She had a wonderful phrase, which is that music is the soundtrack of our lives. And I'd love to just cast you back a little bit to the 1960s. What was the soundtrack as you were growing up? Any particular artists that you loved, you followed, or that when you think about that time, the music comes to you?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think about this every day. And I'll do it a little unusual slant to your question. About 5 years ago, I was asked to join a case as an economic expert on valuation. And the song, it was a particular song that was plaintiffs were suing on infringement. But the song was so powerful for me personally and culturally that I didn't think that I could actually provide a service without gushing and getting all sentimental and spiritual, because I had to be sort of an unabashed, sort of sober economist. And that song was Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. I just said to the lawyers, I said, that song means so much to me that every time I hear it, I'm young. And every time I hear it, there's a future. And every time I hear it, there's the art of possibility. And with all that sort of drama in my mind, how can I just talk about the cash flows? It would be very hard to do that. So actually had a party when I was 50 years old. My wife threw a party and we hired a band just for that one song. And so music, literally, I rank music, my top 10 songs, my top 5 songs. Maybe that's part being an economist, part being a music fan. But Stairway to Heaven, people know, is my standard for that kind of business.
Well, that's beautifully said. And I totally agree about it thrusting us back into our mindset at that time. I love it. Then let's fast forward to founding Massarsky Consulting. What led to that?
So life takes you on a very unusual path. And it's not always a path that you had picked out for yourself. There's also something spiritual that's guiding you, perhaps. But I'll say 2 days ago, January 24th, was the 41st anniversary of my departing ASCAP. And I didn't depart it easily. Not everything happens the way you want. One day you walk into an office, and at the end of the day, you walk out that office never to return again. And then wind up literally at a loss. So sometimes your greatest achievements come from your darkest moments. And I, frankly, wasn't sure what to do after leaving a company I've been with for 10 years. I had 2 young children. And my wife put a task on my desk and said, here's a legal size pad. Write down each name that you might know in the business that you could call and create your own network. And I remember saying to my wife, does it have to be a legal size pad? Can we have a shorter pad? Because I don't know as many people. It was a very insulated market that I was familiar with. And it was clear to me, and in 1992, when this happened, people didn't start consulting firms. People stay in large firms. You went from a big firm to a big firm. And if you worked for consulting, it seemed like you were just waiting for something else to happen in the meanwhile. But I realized that my personality was so dominant in how I saw things that I probably needed multiple clients to sort of disperse this emotion, this passion across many different channels. I think that's exactly what happened. And consulting was a perfect bromide for that. So I wound up setting up shop in 1992, actually in June of 1992. And you don't even know how a consulting client's going to start. Now, what's the starting point? Here I am. I have some knowledge about ASCAP, some knowledge about music publishing. And the world wasn't exactly on fire for that information at that time. It just wasn't. This is a very honest appraisal here. So I got a lead to go to Washington, D.C., and to meet the chairwoman of the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA. Her name is Hillary Rosen. And, at that time in 1992, the record industry was a big box business. They sold records. That's what they did. They were entering from the physical sort of vinyl to CD, and everything was about distribution and marketing channels and, getting the product in and out the door and pricing and inventory and all those things. I had no experience with any of that. All I knew was how music copyrights flowed. And that wasn't obvious to me that that's what their business was. And this incredibly intellectually proven person, Hillary Rosen, said to me in 1992 that one day this music industry that we are so fond of will transform itself from a big box industry to an intellectual property control. And you are going to help us get there. And your background is going to help facilitate that movement to what's now become streaming. And I looked at her with absolute dare and said, well, how do I fit into that discussion? And she said, Barry, we want you to build us ASCAP. Build it for us. And what came of that was a well-known music royalty clearinghouse called Sound Exchange that now represents all these people and their digital rights for recorded music. And I helped to sort of pioneer the economic strategy of that startup. And that gave me a lot of fluidity to go to other clients and talk about intellectual property. And before I knew it, I had these three major clients, this sort of the sandstone of how my business started. The record industry, which introduced me to Sony Music and Universal Music. I mean, it was so much fun because I got a firsthand look at how all these companies operate. A small company, may be less known than ASCAP or BMI, but competing with ASCAP BMI, called CSAC, SESAC, which represented itself in Nashville and wanted to compete with ASCAP, hired me as they call it, their consigliere. Because if you know how ASCAP is run, we want you to help us compete with ASCAP. And a whole new trio of entrepreneurs, private equity came in to buy that company. It was privately held. So I got to know private equity and got to know how they look at capital and put capital to play. And I'm still with CSEC all these years later. And the third, and I don't know if you see behind my shoulder, there's this record publishing company called Zomba, Z-O-M-B-A. And they were on fire in the 1990s with artists like Britney Spears and Shania Twain and Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. And they wanted some of my guidance and some of the work that they were doing. Wow, that was really, a real rival point for me. And when they got sold to another company called BMG, all their executives were like dandelion spores. They went out to different companies as executives and brought me along to their companies. So before I knew it, I was all over the place because of the great standing I had with this company, Zomba. So that was the starting point of Massarsky Consulting.
That's a great story. And I saw that name and I thought it was Zumba, as in the dance fitness craze. So now I'm educating myself even more here. Let's go now to the music world today. Clearly, that person you met in Washington, D.C. was very prescient in terms of how the industry would transform itself. And it has transformed itself maybe into a great success story with streaming, when for a while, maybe it looked like that might be the end of royalty protection. Can you paint a picture for us of the current state of the music business today and how you see it evolving over the next few years?
So the real success of the music industry, in my world, comes down to three individuals whose names are not important overall, but they are record executives at Sony, Warner's, and Universal. And when streaming came on board as a practical alternative to peer-to-peer file sharing and play for free concepts, and now people can get a complete library or inventory of all recordings for a subscription rather than a physical possession of a product, it gained tremendous guidance that the business was going to transform itself. But the real issue is not how streaming did, although it's done well, and we could talk about the growth of 4 or 5 of the major digital service providers, but it was these record company executives who actually are anonymous, who looked at Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and so forth and said, we will grant you access and license to our music, but not on a small 5% of revenue or 10% of revenue. That's what I was familiar with from my ASCAP and CSAC days. But we're content owners. We should share in the profits. And they created relationships that got them up to 50, 55% of the revenues earned by those services. That had never happened before around the world, that the content owners and the content users shared almost equally the value of what was being created. So to me, that was a huge step forward. Streaming had to be successful, sure, but the role of how content licensing being so magnanimous, magnificent, was for a first-time experience. So today, where are we? We're just doing so well that financial investors can't keep up with us. We're so far beyond their expectations. Why? Because the world is not about streaming. It is for the record companies, and we have double-digit growth out for the next several years, and that's compounded growth. And that's not just growth, that's linear growth. That's also vintage acts are now getting very popular on streaming services as well as to new music, and it's populating all tastes and consumer interests. But on the publishing side, they just earned through a tribunal who sets rates in federal court called the Copyright Royalty Tribunal, a high rate increase for what publishers get as a percentage of revenue from these digital services. And there has been a growth in that source for the publishers on average about 13.6%. So when you think about the publishing side, which is the composition, the ownership of the copyright, the song, the creation, they are getting double-digit increases from what we call mechanical income. That's the form used to describe licensing. There's also been a tremendous growth in what we call synchronization licensing. Again, a fairly archaic term, but it's when music is intertwined with an audiovisual product like a film, a television show, or commercial for the first time as a market-based license. And the value of those licenses increased because of the tremendous explosion of streaming video on demand services that have a sort of insatiable thirst for music. Also, we have a new invention. It's not just even streaming anymore. We have a whole new revenue source called, digital platform services such as Roblox and Facebook and Peloton and so forth. And they're now paying license fees on top of what streaming is paying. And if that isn't enough for you, we have growth in what we call performance licensing, which is, bars and restaurants in the United States, radio, television stations, all fueled by growth across the channel. So there's differences between the type of catalog, which catalogs are doing better than others, but the measurement of that is such that we have profitability indicators across all revenue sectors. There's an industry like it right now, honestly.
There are two aspects I'd love to ask you about, because I'm sure you can update me on the pattern there. One is the willingness of consumers to pay. Paying for content, is that just a given now? That consumers are prepared to pay their Spotify subscription, for example, and are just used to that now with music?
So that's a huge change of behavior. So if we went into this high inflationary period with the dogma of still paying $19 or $20 for a record and getting 12 tracks, some of which you want, some of which you're not really willing to buy, there would be a tremendous pull on demand. But the ability to sort of pay $10 a month or whatever to get access to all your music almost makes it like oil. It's just an inflexible good. If people just will pay it, they will pay it easily. They'll access it easily. It doesn't change much. It doesn't change their financial planning and thinking much. This was a brilliant move. So buy a record, you're thinking about, do I have enough money to buy that record? But you have a long ongoing subscription with one of the services, or maybe more than one. You're not changing your consumer habits in this economy. That's a brilliant sort of maneuver of why music has done so well in this past several months, a year.
And then the second part of the question was around IP protection. You mentioned that was the direction it was moving in, from big box to intellectual property protection. How watertight is that? We're in an era where, it seems like cyber crime is on the rise, and obviously we're global as a business now, and there are certain regions perhaps more protective of intellectual property rights than others. Is the regulatory environment or the enforcement environment on top of the development of some of these platforms?
I haven't thought about it that way, but it's another great cure that streaming created. Before streaming took hold, we had a dark period where we had peer-to-peer groups that were organizing around us and in spite of us and lifting intellectual property and putting it on free sites. And people would say, the argument would be, why should I pay for a digital download, which is what they had available to them, when I can gain access on freemium to these sites that the quality might not be the same, but the access to the music is there for them. Streaming wiped away that entire market because people were willing to pay $10 a month for what they really wanted was access to everything. That was the key thing, access to everything. Don't sell me 12 songs on a record. Give me what I want, when I want it, and how I want it. And streaming was the solution for those folks. So those peer-to-peer services that were outlawed and that the RIAA had to sue and got all the negative publicity for suing, they literally went the way of the dodo bird, as these digital services offered rightful, license accepted value proposition to the consumers. So I think that IP protection is always an issue in certain sort of corners of the market, but it's not the dominant concern it once was. Digital services such as Spotify and others has really helped us along that path.
And one thing I'd love to ask you from your vantage point is just because you have your finger on the pulse of demand, what genres are maybe surprising you in their popularity today? Is anything being resurrected? Or where do you see sort of the demand picture moving?
So, okay, these questions are perfectly poised for, I hope, good answers. What has really surprised me about the asset funds market is how wide it is, how deep it is, and how consistent it has been. What we're seeing today is that what's being transacted are all kinds of music. We're looking at music and film and television. We're looking at dance music. We're looking at progressive rock. We're looking at classical music. We're looking at country music. We're looking at standards rock and pop and R&B and urban. It's all in there. And people are not just buying access to this music. They're buying different types of rights. I'll buy passive revenue streams. I won't necessarily be able to affect the change, but at least I'll have a piece of the puzzle. I'll buy distribution channels. I'll buy masters, the record company side. I'll buy just the publisher side. There's so many ways to slice and dice, such that we see now there are about 50 operating music asset investment funds that are traveling into and circulating in this marketplace. But one thing I think is really interesting on a sort of technical level about how the market is doing is, a lot of folks would say that with rising interest rates, there is a push, there's a withdrawal of value in some of these great music assets. It's inevitable that would happen. And the way that we measure things in a very back of the envelope way, although analytically it's not pure on a per catalog basis, is that you look at the business as a multiple of earnings. That is, when you do this sort of what's the value of the catalog, net present value, you get that specific number, and then you compare it against the most recent annual year's earnings, which is, we call that net publisher value or net label value. That's the multiple, that's the ratio. What's the premium that the industry is willing to pay on revenue for access to buy that catalog? And you would think that in a case of these turbulent times last year, that multiple would go down because people's appetites would start to decrease. But in fact, we do most of the industry's work, and we're showing that the average multiple has actually increased in 2022. Again, there's not a market that can say that there's actually been a raise in value. Not necessarily, there may be slightly fewer transactions this past year, but the price that was paid, or the value price, held its own or increased over time. Now, there are two different parts to that story, though, that has to be described. We break that into standards or vintage catalog, pre-2005. That's where the premium is highest, steady state. People know exactly what those cash flows are. These aren't songs that are on the charts and then gone off the charts. They are, constantly on streaming, constantly on radio. They have an even and proven track record, and there's a premium built into the multiple. People pay more for that because they have a greater capability and the risk tolerance is such. So those will go for like 20, 21 times cash flow. Whereas new music that's created in the last couple of years, for instance, which is still trying to find its way to steady state, but it's like exploded on TikTok or exploded on streaming or in radio. There's only one place for that to go, and it's down, right? Because when you're peaking, then you have to measure the decay curve or the descension curve to get back to steady state. So we do those studies for all the investors, and there's a risk issue with that. And so they trade at a lower multiple as a result than the standards do. So and the certain formats trade a little higher than others. It's not, I give you averages, and the industry treats different types of music differently, but everybody is transacting on all cylinders these days.
And is there any sense that, a bit like art, there is kind of a prestige value to some of these catalogs? I'm just thinking of the famous artist who just sold his catalog, was reported the last day for 200 million. Do you get a sense that this market goes in cycles in terms of valuations?
No, actually, I think that I understand that there's a lot of press attached to the Justin Biebers and the Stings and the Paul Simons, but that just gives legitimacy to the market. There are deals going on every day and parts of songs that people own that if you knew who the artists were, so wow, I can't believe that happened. So it's just about what the press grabs. But beneath that, what we're seeing is tremendous activity every day. All these funds are active all the time because they have to put capital to market. So I don't think it works in cycles. I think it's consistent. And definitely sellers are out there. People want to sell their music. They're not even selling their full catalog. They could be selling catalog up to a certain time frame and then say, okay, I'm still creating. I'm going to hold those futures in my. We have one famous writer, national writer. He has sold 3 of his catalogs, different sort of tranches. I don't know how we count that in our volume. So there's just so many ways that this business is happening these days.
That's fascinating. Well, I do want to move to some personal reflections, but just one last question that I always ask on this podcast, which is around diversity in the industry that you work in. My vantage point of finance is not a particularly diverse industry, but then music arguably is quite diverse. It represents the society we live in. How's the music industry? Do you find the music industry is a clubby, exclusive one? Do you find it's open to all?
I'm concerned. Actually, in my career, most of my bosses have been women in my career, but I didn't realize it until I just said that. I wasn't conscious of that. And that's the whole point of it, in my view, is that it should not be a barrier. It should just be structurally understood that the best talent wins regardless. That's sort of my indicator of value. But I find that women and minorities are left out in most of these conversations. They're not, as we did interview Charisse, but Charisse, frankly, is an outlier. And I wish that this was a different business that way. It's moving in a direction, but it's slowed down, I feel. We don't have enough women executives that can bowl and have, representation of a large value. Even in the investment community, most of the professionals are male. So I wish it were a little stronger, and I am conscious of it. I'm very conscious of that.
Well, thanks for sharing those insights. Getting back to personal reflections, what would you say were some of the highs and lows of your career so far?
Well, I'll give you 2 highs and 2 lows, so we can just, now make this a 2-day marathon. One of the highs that happened in my career, I talk a lot about music, the value of music, how music is transacting. I know a lot about catalogs and artists and so forth, but you typically meet lawyers, you typically meet business managers, you typically meet the business sides of everything. You don't really meet the talent. That's usually a little bit far away from me. But there was one well-known, incredibly beautiful composer who cut through all of that and found me about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, and said, look, I only deal with people directly. I don't use the internet. I don't even write. Everything's about a conversation. Everything is about a meal, actually. And for me to trust you to sell my catalog, which I don't even do, but he wanted me to take that unusual step, we need to get to know each other on a personal level. And his name was, because he passed away, Marvin Hamlish, who had a great body of work. He wrote the scores to A Chorus Line and The Way We Were, and lots of film scores, and just a gigantic talent. And I'll never forget, getting to know him and organizing his set of data for a transaction to be sold. And he invited my wife and I he was the national guest conductor at the National Symphony in Washington, and who was performing with an artist, Dina Menzel. And he was in his tuxedo, and he was, getting rave reviews and an ovation, actually. And he invited us to come back to his dressing room because we were having dinner after the show was over. And this is a guy who gets a standing ovation literally every night he performs, like 2/3 of the time. And he said, Barry, did you see I got a standing ovation tonight? And I said, Marvin, you got a standing ovation every night. And he looked and said, but every night it's special. And what I got from that was slow down. Some of the peer people you get to meet, some of the work you get to do, something you should enjoy every day at one point in your day. Slow down and take the reality and bring it inside. It was a very humbling moment for me. It really was. The second was a little more recently. We were in London, my partner and I, and one of our largest clients, one of those funds that we were talking about, is called Hypnosis, which actually is quite large. It actually trades in the London Stock Exchange. And the work that we do in the valuation really impacts that market price. And so we go to London and meet with the board and explain our views of the business and profile the value. And all I can say is it's a sobering experience. And sitting there with my partner, going through the data and our analysis and our valuation with a very enterprising board. And it was interesting that while we're going through all this, Nile Rodgers, who's a well-known artist, is also on the board of hypnosis, sat down and we're having some conversation. I turned to my partner, Nari Matsur, and I said, it'd be great if we could just chill the crowd out. And I saw upstairs in this office, Annie Lennox's grand piano outside of Merck's office. It'd be really great if you could play, because she is she's a virtuoso pianist. Before I met her, she said yes, which I've never asked her in 21 years, but I thought it was the right moment at the right time. And we go upstairs to the piano and she sits on the bench and Nile Rodgers sits next to her. And she put out this Mozart piece that completely mellowed the entire building. I've never heard such music come out of the piano before. And I realized again that we're in the commerce of business, but we really are in the music business. And I watched Nile Rodgers with great admiration look at my partner, not because of her brains as a valuer, but because of her artistry as a pianist. And I thought that was a very cool moment. So those are the two moments that I remember.
And those are the high points. I'm sure it's a volatile industry and it has its low points. I mean, there are so many songs about life's low points. Anything you could share there in terms of ups and downs?
Well, the one that I keep on remembering, because I believe strongly that with all the success that I have experienced in my career, that you have to sort of bring that back. You have to sort of control for the success. Success is not something you deserve. Success is something that usually luck bestows upon you. So I'm a little bit on that side. And as I said to you, after 10 years of working at ASCAP, one day somebody zipped it up and said, you're done. You're gone. And I remember that being, if I don't know if this term means anything to you, but an out-of-body experience. Literally, I always remember myself watching myself. Like literally, I saw a shadow of myself observing how I was handling this in complete stress of something ending before I understood it was over. And I don't care what I do for the rest of my career. Being that unprotected, being that unprepared, being that unknowing, it's a terrible place to be for anybody. So I tried to be a little more careful. I tried to be a little bit more observant of others. I try to be bestowing my judgment and my beliefs on others that are coming up the ladder, because I feel that I don't want them to be left unaware and uninvolved and unprotected. And I have a duty to sort of play it forward and make sure that people who work with me have a great responsibility for their own careers. And so that's the way I manage people. I manage them with the concern that I had that day.
Well, one of the questions I usually ask is around key people or key wisdom that those people have imparted to you. You've already named a number of people. Feel free to name any more, or just any wisdom or creed or motto that people have imparted to you or that you've developed on your own.
Well, I would answer that this way. Every day, I reach out to at least 5 people that I'm not necessarily working with, just because every day, 5 different people. If you do this every day for 20, 30 years, you amass thousands of people. You really do. And so I think that the connectivity to people, it's not what I know that's so interesting. I'm really not that amazed by my own self-value. I'm not that impressed. But boy, am I impressed with others. And they keep on helping me think and rethink and understand. I love how people tell their stories to me. And they mean so much to me. So what I've learned is not from an individual. I've learned the art of listening. So while it's important to share a view, it's equally as important to comprehend somebody else's view. And if you do that on a regular basis, people gain trust and confidence in you. And then your job becomes a hobby, and your hobby becomes your job. And before you know it, you can't get to the office quick enough because you can't wait for the next several people you're going to get a chance to meet. And that, my friend, is the art of success. At the end of the day, to me, and I'll say this very directly to you, It can't be about the amount of money that we've acquired, although that does help in the goings on in life, because it just seems so temporal to me. But boy, if you really treated people well and ethically and helped people grow around you, man, that might be a career worth talking about now. That might be cool. It may be something that you can sleep at night and say, boy, I'm glad that those people are doing okay. I think that's a nice testimony to a career.
Well, Barry, I can't think of a better way to bring this very rich and melodic conversation to a close. It has been wonderful for you to bring the world of music both down to earth and to life for us through this conversation, and also through your own discussion of your own career to bring many words of wisdom to us. So thank you for this educational journey.
Thank you for the wonderful set of questions I got a chance to respond to. Thank you for that.
As well as the ones that I hadn't put on the script, but that's the element of surprise is always nice as well. I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.